So the Lord Mayor touched on it there a bit at the end, and I think I wanted to start, I guess, with a bit of a story from something that I've experienced recently. I have to lower this a little bit. There we go. I recently, as David mentioned off the top, we're going through a sort of 5-year review of the 30-year plan for Adelaide, and I was invited to participate in a consultation workshop as part of that, and I found myself in a room full of planners. So that was interesting in itself. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but just I was sort of the odd one out in that environment, which was an opportunity. The discussion came to integrated design, and in essence, I guess integrated design is about considering all factors to inform positive outcomes. So fundamentally, at the moment, I feel, and I would like to hear some thoughts on this, that I think we have a particularly prescriptive sort of framework in our policies around how we want to build our city. So for me, I floated this idea of a more performance-based assessment for how we might actually produce our city, really. And I guess I'd just like to throw it to everyone that what's their thoughts on that, because that particularly talks to what the 5-year sort of rewiring of the greater plan for Adelaide talks about.
I can kick, is that working? Yeah, I can kick off with that one perhaps. And it goes back to, I'm not sure how many of you were here last Wednesday hearing Indy Johar talk about that particular topic, but the idea that we need to be a lot more, have a much more powerful way of actually measuring outcomes. So if we put in a bike lane, it will save our health budget money. And how do we actually do the cross transfer of funding, etc., to allow that to happen? Because if we can put mechanisms in place, and I think the technical term is hypothecation, which the accounting rules prevent, from what I understand at the moment. The government's basically accounting for future spend or future savings and spending them now if they're not sort of in the same area of expenditure. So I think one of the things that we will be advocating as an institute is to let's actually look at by creating some of this infrastructure, are we actually saving money elsewhere or improving outcomes elsewhere, and how we might join some of those conversations back up into the planning system. So the planning system isn't just focused on land use, transport, built environment, all those physical sort of aspects. What are the social outcomes you're getting from it? What are the health benefits, etc., etc. And I think that's going to be a tough nut to crack, and it's not an easy one, but I think it's something that we actually need to get a lot more sophisticated with.
Does anyone else have any commentary on that?
Is this on? The thought that comes to mind for me is it's about giving people the information and the education in the community to make up their own minds. And it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, the government tries to do it, but I think everybody's kind of suspicious that the government puts stuff out there that it's kind of propaganda. But how do we give people the opportunity to learn and understand so they can make a decision and see the benefits for themselves?
Yeah, just to that, I guess maybe, and a bit of a follow-on question, like how do we rewire our culture here, and what are the things that we need to be doing to sort of, I mean, and that's a government thing, it's an industry thing, it's a community thing. How do we start to rewire ourselves to be more open and receptive to this change? Because the transformation is coming and it's profound, and if we sort of find ourselves in a state of inertia, we'll very quickly be left behind, and it has huge ramifications.
Can I just quickly add to that? I think we look to the government to make these decisions or to tell us the answers, and then we don't like them. I think we need to, other parts of the community and other sectors need to start having a voice and giving their opinions, or being a place of knowledge where people can go and find out things for themselves. It's not about standing back and waiting for government, it's about stepping forward.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any comments on that?
I think from a government level and the local government level I'll speak of, but I think we just need to lead by example with demonstration projects are really important. And examples, we've got a Free City Connector bus fleet which whizzes around the city every 15 minutes. There's half a dozen buses in that fleet. It's a very, very popular service, and it's growing in popularity, and we expect it to continue to do so. But maybe we should be saying, right, well, let's have 6 electric buses in that fleet. That's as a demonstrator, as a very, very visual demonstrator to the general public. Because it's like having half a dozen billboards running around the city all day long about sustainability. So I think our job as a government is not to do all of the doing, but is to enable. So we can do demonstration projects, we can put incentives in place, we can put policy in place, but we need to let the community grab this and run with it. And organisations like Uber. So that our job is to kind of set the framework, in some regards, then get out of the way. So, but it'll happen faster that way. If you leave it all to government, we're too cumbersome, we're too slow. So we need to enable you to do it, but we need to create those conditions so you can.
So yeah, maybe Tom might speak about this, but how do you facilitate that environment? I mean, I guess the point of something like today is to have all those different people at the table, but then how do we take the next step? But yeah, Tom.
I was going to make an observation about what I think people respond to, and I think people respond best to objective evidence of success. And the way that we inform them on that is to gather data effectively. And I don't think governments do that well enough. The advent of technology is making the gathering of data to illustrate the success or failure of projects very simple these days in many cases. One example that springs to mind from an Australian city that we've been speaking to relates to congestion on roads and the movement of vehicles, and there are particular sensors that are embedded in freeways in this city, and they're expensive and they're a bit faulty from time to time, but they're only placed every 500 metres. And so the data is very patchy, it's not reliable, it doesn't tell a good story, but the reality is that every person who's driving on those roads these days has a mobile phone with a GPS sensor in it, a gyroscope, an accelerometer, and all of that data can be crowdsourced to paint a much more illustrative picture than sensors every 500 metres. Doesn't cost the taxpayer anything, it's more efficient, it paints a better picture. So that's one example of how governments can use existing technology more intelligently, more cheaply than they have at their disposal now.
So why aren't we doing this right now? Why isn't there an app that people in the community can download and it follows them everywhere we go, and people can buy that data and use it to inform decision making?
A bit of it is happening, just not enough.
Okay.
So this report that I referenced, the IPA was using data that we've pulled from driver partners' phones moving around the road. In Adelaide, there's 1,000 odd driver partners on the road in a given month. In Perth, it's 5,000. Melbourne and Sydney, 14,000. When these numbers scale up, they start to represent a pretty reliable indication of vehicle movement around the city and where the pressure points are in infrastructure. So we would always be happy to partner with government under the right circumstances. There are privacy considerations to be considered, but under the right circumstances to help them make better decisions and to better understand how their assets are kind of sweating and what value they're getting out of them.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe Rita, because I guess you talked a bit about the communication of this sort of thing before, and perhaps that idea of there's a big brother kind of element to all that as well, and how that might be perceived in the marketplace. But yeah, Rita.
Yeah, I think primarily it's about doing things differently to what we've ever done, and the roles are changing. It's not government's, government's roles have been certain things in the past, but, within a collaborative environment and in an agile sort of framing of this innovation, you really can't have roles defined yet because you really don't know what needs to be done. We're learning together, we're learning rapidly together. And some of the barriers that have existed and currently still exist, some of the misnomers about what the community won't accept and what they will accept, it's all preemptive because, if we want to make such a massive step change, and the benefits are significant, there's social benefits and economic benefits, we really have to just really collapse the existing structures and work together as a collaboration, facilitate and enable, and having strong leadership like the Lord Mayor. But essentially the reason why we've got our pod on North Terrace and not locked up in a conference venue with select people is so that people can see it. It's not moving, but at least we're having a conversation, and the next time, so those people will have conversations with other people. We haven't got great researchers out there talking about it. We've got young people who are going to be the next generation of researchers, the next generation of users of this technology. And on North Terrace, which is such a fantastic precinct that mixes the sort of young and emerging, and next to the museum, we thought it was a perfect setting. So great that you're hosting it here. So I suppose my takeaway is that, yes, we are on the cusp. There's lots of data. But if we use the locked-in mentality of the way we always did things, the roles of government, the roles of industry, the roles of researchers, we're going to get the same. We're not going to go very far. We just need to collapse that, work together as equals, and then put the community at the front. What is it that they want? And then where's the data that helps us to, to build that most effectively? So that's my...
I go back to the Uber pool example. I mean, I think if we cast our minds back 10 years and we asked people whether they would be happy to get into a car with a stranger to go to the footy or into the city on the weekend or in the morning, they would have been a bit sceptical. But technology has evolved to a point where it's hyper convenient to do it, and we're operating at a scale now where the costs are significantly reduced. It's about putting, I think people are ultimately rational. You put the right incentives in front of them, they'll respond to those incentives. In the case of passengers, it's price and convenience. In the case of driver partners offering the service, it's earnings potential. But people are ultimately rational and will respond to those incentives if they're put in front of them.
Dino, also part of government's role is, of course, infrastructure. And this, infrastructure to enable greater outcomes. And I've got a couple of really poignant and very relevant announcements which Adelaide City Council has made. On the weekend, we announced that we're laying out 40 electric vehicle charging stations on our city streets in 2017. So by Christmas next year, they'll all be in. Now, that would put Adelaide in a leading position nationally in terms of electric vehicle charging infrastructure on city streets. Secondly, as recently as last night in the council chamber, we endorsed a multi-million-dollar budget for another initiative we're rolling out in 2017, which is smart parking initiatives. Now, effectively, we've got a goal by 2020 to be virtually expiation-free. So that's our end goal. So we work back from that and we say, how do we do it? And what we do know, that of course 35% of carbon emissions in the City of Adelaide are coming from private vehicles, coming from vehicles, and 90% of that is coming from private vehicles. But we also know that about 30% of the time that people spend driving around the city is actually looking for a car park. It's extraordinary. So we're thinking, right, how can we do that a lot more efficiently? So we've recognised the problem, then we worked on the solution. What we're doing next year, and this is transformational for Australia, is that we are basically we're putting sensors, underground sensors, in virtually all of our on-street car parks. The sensor will tell you whether there's a vehicle in the car park or not. It could be a 2-hour car park. You'll be able to pay for it on an app on your phone. You then, 15 minutes before which time your car park is customarily due to expire, you'll receive a text message and it'll tell you your car park's about to expire. Do you want to top up? And this is how we become expiation free. So you will then have the choice as the consumer back in your hands. And you'll be able to top up for an hour. You might pay a premium to top up because we have a vested interest in ensuring that car parks keep turning over. That's good for our main streets. But the power is now in your hands. So those two initiatives alone, I think will catalyse a whole range of other things. Some of them we know, some of them we don't know. But it'll reduce carbon. It'll improve efficiency, it'll reduce stress, you'll get less parking fines, and you're going to love that. And it's going to make you more time efficient because your app will tell you that there are 9 free car parks on the street on Hutt Street right now. And it'll tell you where they are. You can drive straight to it and you can pull in. And it'll be live data which will keep changing. So this is Australia leading stuff. So again, this is just an example whereby government needs to lead through, that's a big demonstration project, but it's a terrific one. So we think it's just going to catalyse a whole range of additional things over time. So infrastructure plays a lot to do with this too.
Yeah. So what I've heard just then in all of those comments is the idea that get the data, get the evidence, do the modelling and then act on it. And that goes back to the proposition I had before about having a much more sophisticated model of our city that actually aggregates all of this information into one spot so that we can actually test all these things and not gather data in little packets, but what does it mean to put a railway station in somewhere and affect pedestrian flows and car parking and actually be ahead of the game in terms of how we then therefore go and plan our cities and set up our policy frameworks. And if we've got an evidence base that continually feeds back, I think we'll end up in a much stronger position from a planning point of view, to the point of avoiding the sort of community confrontations that we as design professionals always end up in around how we engage with people, because there's evidence that actually underpins it. And that idea, that quote before about people respond to objective measures of success is a great one, I think.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add to that. We had a discussion earlier today, and one of the points that was brought up about how South Australia and Adelaide in particular represents an opportunity to be a testing bed, that kind of idea that there's a certain scale and agility and I guess level of risk aversion perhaps that allows you to test ideas very quickly, see if they work in the marketplace. So why not, and if you think about the city as a brand and what it represents, why not perhaps then that investment in creating all that infrastructure to analyse data so that we can attract some of the world's best companies to come here and test their ideas in the city of Adelaide. What might that do for stimulating, Adelaide and South Australia and our position globally as well? I'm interested to hear anyone's comments on that.
Well, that's fundamentally one of the key pillars of the Australian Driverless Vehicle Initiative, is really to show that Australia's got that environment that will allow that sort of learning by deployment, learning by doing. It's got the regulatory frameworks and it's got the appetite from governments. And we're talking to a lot of international companies that really see that as a huge advantage. A huge advantage from governments, receptiveness, the messages that are coming out from Australia, but also those organisations that, and even the researchers that are looking maybe to go overseas to do work, considering there's great opportunities here. So I think there is definitely that is a huge selling point for Australia, and significantly in South Australia, where we have the Governor, the Premier, the ministers and the Lord Mayor of the capital city all saying the same thing. I don't think there's ever been a time that's, or there's been something that's centred on that, and really acting in a way to promote that rather than just saying, but actually doing actions. And I just wanted to talk to, I think, what you've mentioned about a vision of being, expiation free. You really have to start with the vision. And our vision is really about those, reductions in crashes and injuries, the $80 billion, the 1,200 lives that are lost on our roads, the significant injuries. If that's not a motivating factor, that we can do something about that and get a real economic and social benefit. And the other part is what the community is telling us is about vulnerability and mobility for people who are disabled. That's a real social benefit that I think we can start, leveraging off of. And some of the other things that we do that, will have to change to enable that are what we should be focusing on, rather than, just looking at the little steps along the way. Look at the big picture and how we get there quickly. And the longer we take, the more lives, we sacrifice along the way. So that's a bit of an emotive plea, but, coming from a road safety background, that's really what underpins this. It's not just technology, it's about the benefits of the technology.
Yeah, that's 100% correct, and that idea of more performance-based assessment instead of prescriptive, I think, is at the heart of all that. So I guess maybe now, unless anyone else had any more comments? No, maybe open it to the floor if there was any questions that anyone wanted to ask. Yes?
I'm possibly the oldest person in the room. It's not usual, but it's good because it shows the interest here, which is fantastic. I'm excited by this discussion. Lord Mayor, I think you captured that word convergence. If I may borrow from Penny, please reflect on history. And I'm an urban planner sitting with architects, and by the way, we're all designers, but some have got more technical expertise than others. But reflect on history. When I was born, it was the disabling of the public transport system in the form of trams, because General Motors was coming to town and they actually started buying up trams. And Playford, for the right reasons, to get employment, second generation away from farming, sponsored that and all the white goods industries. So that's a bit over 60 years ago. We've seen change, and there is a constant. It's called change. It's nearly as constant as the sun rising each morning. And what we're going to do is focus on that change over time. And when you get more than 1 and 2 and 10 and 50 people starting to believe in it, it starts to happen and gets very, very exciting. And Rita and I worked on a place called Semaphore Road, do you remember? 30 years ago. And have a look at Semaphore Road now when it came out of absolute doldrums. And it's one of the best main streets in the city with a special character, because there's only one place in the world called Semaphore, by the way. Putting that aside, where I'm getting to is we've got to believe in the South Australian capacity to grab good ideas and collaborate to achieve them and bring real benefit to our communities. And as we can't afford to keep building the big roads, notwithstanding we need a north-south corridor, we can't do it. We've got to utilise what we've got better and be focused in how we spend our money. And the projects that the Lord Mayor spoke of is about utilising what we've got better And what we need to see is this is not just city against regional against others. It's an opportunity to demonstrate what we can do here in the city and the inner suburbs, which can then be transported away, and it actually gives us a new industry. And I just appreciate your comments on that.
Some would know that the peak of the South Australian or the Adelaide tram system was about 1958, and then it all started to come out, of course, but we had an extensive tram system, and many would know, of course, that there's going to be a tram returning here to North Terrace, and that construction work will start next year. So the tram is going to be extended down to the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site, which we think for North Terrace Cultural Boulevard, for our universities, for our institutions, for our new hospital and the old Royal Adelaide Hospital on that site, it'll be quite transformational. And we know the relationship between light rail and economic development and what it will catalyse in terms of residential attraction and small business and a whole range of things. So, and it's interesting, it's sometimes when we of course talk about transport we often default to cars, but it's a mixed use transport discussion, and it always is. So trams are a very, very important part of that, undoubtedly, and they have social and they have economic benefits, and of course they have transport benefits, so very, very important. But so is cycling, so is walking. We've partnered with the State Government of South Australia. We're investing $12 million into cycling infrastructure over the next 24 months. And that's the largest investment in cycling infrastructure in the history of the City of Adelaide. So that work starts next year, and that's about a north-south and an east-west segregated cycling corridor right through the city to join up literally Unley with Prospect and West Torrens with Burnside. So we'll hear a lot more about that project towards the end of this year and early next year, and then we'll start construction. So it's about getting that mix right. There's no doubt about it. And I'm very passionate about bringing this tram back to North Terrace. I think that was the logical first step. You would have heard of the Adelink project, which Minister Stephen Mulligan has been championing. There's a study being done around Adelink, which is about really the reinstatement of a tram corridor north, south, east and west. But we felt the best place to start was some extensions in the city. And this is the first outcome of that, which is really exciting. So it's about getting the mix right. I think all of this will serve our city very well. I think it'll make our city more livable. I think we've got a deeply walkable city, and it's a great strength of Adelaide, as you know. But we've got to get our transport mix right, which I think we're on the right track.
Can I share just an observation on that, on a related point? One of the interesting things we're seeing in our data is that the Uber platform and public transport is interacting to an increasing degree. Mm-hmm. And what we've done in a number of cities is created little what we call geo-fences around train stations in cities, and then had a look at the trips that are starting and ending in that fence. And you end up with all this multitude of little spider webs. It's what we call the first mile or last mile of the trip. And so people are taking short trips, might only be $5 or $6 in an Uber, then getting on a train and heading into a CBD, and then doing the same thing again at night because it's cheaper than driving into the city and paying for parking. But I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that these things are exclusive of one another. They're very much interactive with each other, and we're seeing that to an increasing extent as our platform matures in a number of markets around Australia.
Can I just pick up a little bit on a point that was made before and wonder whether I think we need a north-south corridor, but given some of the comments that have been made around the way that the technology is improving and we're actually seeing potentially less and less congestion, are we at a point at the moment where we can actually put a moratorium on road building, grit our teeth and, guts out the congestion increase for 3 or 4 years, and then we find that the technology is actually relieving a lot of that congestion and we can refocus some of that cost in road building elsewhere within the budget? Are we at that point between Uber and driverless vehicles, and interested in what the RAA members would think about as well?
Probably not. I mean, there is one scenario that, in fact, congestion will increase when you start having driverless vehicles on the roads for a period of time where people are transitioning and thinking they feel comfortable. I mean, we've asked our members what they think about this, and it's quite interesting. About 36% think that it's a positive thing to have autonomous vehicles on our roads, but 49% don't want to get into them. So I think, it's going to take a bit of time. But I think what's important is the infrastructure that's built today is able to accommodate the technology we will need in the future when autonomous vehicles basically will be talking to each other or talking to some structure on the side of the road. So I think what the people who are making the roads or designing what we need in the next 10 to 20 years needs to make sure it can accommodate the future after that.
I think, sorry, Rita.
I think we should be building smarter roads. We don't need to stop building roads. We need to have smarter roads, and smarter means, linking the public transport. So if you know that if the train's talking to the Uber or talking to the pod or whatever it is that's and you're getting there and you're reliable, it's going to be there, it's going to have enough carriages if there's going to be, 500 more people catching it that day. If we, the data and the information sharing is key to all of this. If I was going to say what you'd stop building park and rides, stop building, these wastelands where people just leave their car there for the day. That's what I'd stop building, if that's in anybody's budgets. The other thing is I've heard Stephen Mulligan say, and he takes to the federal government, is, with the infrastructure spend, maybe carving off some of that to this sort of looking at the future and looking at sort of some of these exemplar projects that could happen, that could actually be demonstrations. And my living lab thing in the laboratories, I think Adelaide is a super city and it could be a super high-tech city, or there's better people than me, but we just need to make sure the communication is that we're not just piloting things that might not work, which is what we might be doing, but we're just actually innovating and we're at the leading edge, and that's more the attractive language I'd like to hear.
I'd stop building car parks too, I suppose that would be the other thing.
Yeah, and I think that's fundamentally the key point here. It's that shift in approach perhaps away from just building things and hoping that we respond to them. It's reverse engineering it and analysing and making more informed decisions. And I suppose it's kind of talking what David was saying, that maybe we do cut off some of that investment and feed it into providing the infrastructure for our city to make those smarter decisions. I think that's something that I'd really love to be able to see. But anyway, were there any other questions?
I'd just like to respond to what was just said. Firstly, thank you to the whole panel. I think what you're saying is very exciting and challenging. But I think there's a big parallel here between transport and our electricity network, where a few years ago people started to talk about the gold plating of our power networks. Irony aside about the recent blackout. But I think in a few years' time, we'll be wishing we hadn't spent a lot of money on some very large infrastructure projects. I was here on Friday and had a very interesting conversation with a group that included bike advocates and someone from government. And the government person was bemoaning the fact that there isn't a lot of money to spend on projects that expand the bike network, which struck me as a really significant irony when we're spending so much on other infrastructure projects. And I think there is a lot that we can cut out of some of those projects. A lot that, in the sense, compared to the size of the budget for alternative ways of doing things, which wouldn't be very much in the scheme of the size of those projects, which have budgets probably 100 or more times the size. Getting back to that analogy, I think if a number of years ago we'd managed to start spending more on distributed energy generation, etc., as an alternative, we would be in a much better situation now in terms of what we're paying for our power. What are your thoughts on how quickly we should be making that change, and whether we should be not putting a moratorium on current construction, but starting the transition of money into those other areas?
Well, I'll just say something about, I agree with you about gold plating. I think one of the things to do is to look at, well, just how much money needs to be invested in a particular piece of road infrastructure. In one sense, I think the Frome Road cycle path was over the top. I mean, if you'd perhaps put in something that was a bit was more modest and didn't cost so much. It might have, those people who didn't accept it might not have objected it too much. I do think we need to be thinking about how much do we need to put in and make sure we don't overspend on infrastructure. We need the right components of road or whatever that is to be safe, but there has been a tendency in the past, I think, sometimes of government to overspend.
I think part of this relationship too, and I just use Frome as an example because it's always a topical one and the media love it. But if we look at Frome, we've got this form versus function discussion too, and I think from a functionality perspective, Frome has performed pretty well. But in terms of form, in terms of the aesthetic, if we talk about cities that attract people to live, cities that attract small businesses to set up and be them cafes or restaurants or whatever they're doing, is we also need to beautify our streets. And we have to get that balance right all the time on all of our projects, the form and the function. They've got to look great. They've got to give that street an uplift aesthetically, but they've also got to function extremely well. And when it comes to cycling, of course, that's a safety discussion. You've got to get the safety aspects right so people feel confident that that's somewhere they can cycle very safely. And these are precisely the types of conversations we're having internally at Town Hall now as we're working on the design options for the north-south, east-west corridor in terms of cycling. We know there's a Adelaide High number 2 will be coming into the old Royal Adelaide Hospital site and the Reed building. That's not that far away, and that brings almost 1,000 new students into the city. So this is all about getting the infrastructure right. But if we think we do get it right, we can attract more residents, we can attract more small businesses, we can provide safer cycling outcomes for those on bikes, very, very important. And we are working with the RAA already. I was with the RAA this week talking about the same thing. So I think we can reconcile all of the sometimes competing needs of everyone, and I think we can get it right. And I think Adelaide can be an exemplar for that. That's why I think we've got such a great opportunity in front of us.
If I just pick up on that form and function thing, the private sector has to go through a design review process whenever they put a build. If you're putting a building up in the city, over $10 million, it goes through the Development Assessment Commission and the Office of Design and Architecture SA. There's a design review process that it goes through. Our our transport infrastructure projects are not subject to that design review. That's mad. I really don't understand why, because the public transport systems are the interface, they're people interfaces first and foremost. They're not engineering edifices. They're about shifting people from one place to another. But we don't subject them to design review, and it's a massive hole in the way that we plan our city. So one of the things that we're advocating very strongly for is we actually need to bring government projects into that process. If the private sector have to do them, and the private sector should have to do them, developing in a city is a very civic it's a very public thing to be doing. We should have our own government actually subjected to that as well. And I think that form versus function discussion then becomes a much more nuanced one and a much more powerful one.
I just want to make sure we can keep moving through some questions. So I've got a gentleman at the back.
I'm a new immigrant to this city, and I love this city. And I have just pay attention to the smart city studio plan, and I have visited there, and I feel exciting about the current trend, about the future change in Adelaide. So my question is, how could public participate in this trend or in this technology change for the future of city? For example, about the project you mentioned just now, the smart parking, because I also have some technology background, so I have researched the current design for the parking, and I think I may probably come to some more economic, efficient design about about this project. So how could the public participate in this trend?
I think when we talk about smart city technologies, and there are a handful of cities around the world who have great reputations for smart city technology, and I think we're fast becoming one of them. Barcelona in Spain is another one, and I think there are some great parallels between Adelaide and Barcelona, I must say. But yes, we talk about smart parking initiatives, and that was an example which will be a very tangible example which everyone will be able to use and experience in 2017. That project will be, I understand, completed by the end of 2017. But it just goes on and on and on. Some would know that we're doing a trial at the moment along Perry Street with regards to smart lighting technology. We've changed about 40% of our streetlights now over to LED, and then some of them we're changing over to smart LED, which effectively means that when there's no activity on the street, the lux level on those lights will drop by about 25%, doesn't compromise safety at all. When there is movement, be it pedestrian or vehicle, the lux level just tips back up again. Now, if we're modelling this, if we did that across our entire city, the energy and cost savings are quite profound. So and the environmental benefits stand to reason in terms of less energy consumption. And it's a conversation I'm very comfortable having with a ratepayer, because I'm saying, well, we're saving you money. So, but again, there are plenty more examples. What we do is, we as a local government, and some of the other speakers I think touched upon this, we collate a profound amount of data, but we don't aggregate that data very well, and we don't probably open source that data very well to create opportunities for you. But we through a growing network of sensors in terms of traffic and environmental and movement sensors around the City of Adelaide, we're beginning to aggregate a lot of data. And we've got the council has endorsed quite a significant, certainly for local government, a very significant resource commitment towards all things ICT and all things smart city. So, but what we ultimately want to do is, through a growing network of sensors throughout the city, aggregate that data, then provide it back to you. And it's very interesting whether that can then help business people make a more informed decision about where they're going to set up their business, be it a hospitality business or be it a retail business or any type of business. They can make a very fact-based discussion, whether it could be sharing empirical evidence back to the retail community and the hospitality community about traffic patterns, so it could impact upon their opening hours, so that we could literally say that 3,000 people walked past your door in the last hour, but you're not open in those hours. Would you reconsider doing that? So it's all about using data to have very empirical kind of discussions, fact-based discussions. I got this kind of Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City. I heard him speak at Paris in December last year at the COP21, and he kept saying to everyone, and it really stuck with me, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And he was talking that in a kind of climate sustainability context, but I think you could use that for an everything context. So how we use that data, and then how we harness that into opportunity for the business community, I think is very, very important.
So how do we fund that right now? How do we do that? Because I think that's a game changer. Like, that's the sort of thing that says to the world, hey, come to Adelaide.
Yeah, well, I think it was originally the Premier's vision in terms of Adelaide test bed, and I think it's got a great deal of traction. Again, that's where our size becomes our competitive strength too. But Adelaide City Council is investing $9 million into its own ICT infrastructure internally, so we can do exactly that, Dino. We run a plethora of different systems at the moment which we need to aggregate, which will give us our own internal operating efficiencies. But it'll help us disseminate data so much clearly so that you can search our vast reserves of data and identify an opportunity for you. So I think in 2017 you'll be hearing a lot more about this from Adelaide City Council. We're putting in the architecture at the moment. We've endorsed the budget, and the ICT team are now busily implementing the solutions. Mm-hmm. So government, be it local, be it state, one resource we have in abundance is data. Just an abundance of data. We don't always know what to do with it, but I think you do. And we just want to be able to open it up so that you can use it.
Okay, just one last question of this gentleman here, and then we'll wrap up because I'm conscious of time.
Firstly, thank you very much, obviously, for all of the initiatives and for your comments today. My question relates to what, presuming once you get your infrastructure correct, etc., the word congestion tax. And is there thoughts about it or comments that might be made? I mean, cities like London, that's how they've dealt with their inner city problems. And is it something that may be on your radars? I
just quickly want to comment on that. I think there's a branding effort about not calling it congestion tax. in the first instance, it should be an efficiency tax, perhaps, where you get incentivised to be more efficient rather than taxed for doing something that's not efficient. Sorry.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when it's school holidays, I don't know if you've noticed, there's a hell of a lot fewer cars on the road and everybody seems to get around just fine. I think there are things you can do first. Clearways, for example. If traffic could flow better, then you wouldn't need a congestion tax, probably in Adelaide. I mean, we're quite peaky. So there is a move, and the review of clearways on the sides of the roads, the government's talking about it, and I don't know what you guys are doing, but haven't changed in 20 years, and people's habits have. So there's probably a number of steps that we need to look at more seriously before we go down that path and say, okay, it's going to cost you if you want to go from here to here at this particular time.
Congestion tax is probably in the same basket of goodies as toll roads. We have discussed it, but we probably think we've got other items which are higher priority in terms of, and it was touched upon beforehand, is that managing our conditions that we have now with greater efficiency and effectiveness. So we've modelled exactly, the smart parking solution which we'll introduce in the city next year, and it virtually covers every single paid on-street car park this solution will provide for in 2017, is that we know that in itself will create less congestion. If 30% of your passenger vehicle traffic on any given day out there right now is wandering around looking for an on-street car park, we're going to cut that down quite significant just through a technological solution. Now that's one, I think, out of many. So I think there's a whole lot of other things we can do to become cleverer in terms of how we deliver more efficient transport, before which time we'd need to contemplate a congestion tax. I think congestion tax is a very blunt instrument. Maybe you're right.
Sorry,
Maybe you're very right.
We'll do just one last one. Just one last, because you were waiting patiently.
Hi, I'm Chris Sampson from Future Earth Systems. Thanks to everyone for great presentations and a great conversation. I was struck by your notion, Rita, of mobility as a service, and I'm reflecting about that logistical conversation that families have, at the start of the day. Shall we take the car and you drop me off, or do you need the car and I'll take the bus, then you can pick me up later, or shall I bring the motorbike and you take the car so we can have more flexibility? What's the weather like? What about cycling? What time is it? How busy is it going to be? Is it still school holidays? Where should we park? These are all part of a dynamic environment, of course, that's different at different times, different days of the week. To add more options into the mix during that logistical conversation, perhaps we need a way to join up and make the conversation easier, make it more about the overall experience. At the moment, it still feels quite siloed. Also, when you join information together, you can create an iterative optimization effect, which might improve the productivity, of course, of our existing infrastructure. I'm thinking about a project in Singapore called Digital Concierge, which was focused on joining up the experience of arriving into Singapore, getting through the airport, getting into the city, and checking into your hotel with the least friction, the least wasted time, and the best experience. Wouldn't it be great if we could introduce that type of ecosystem for the way we move in and out of Adelaide City? I think that's a systems platform. Can Adelaide and South Australia build and own some of that intellectual property?
Chris, actually, I think I was the one who talked about mobility as a service, and yes, you're right. And in fact, there are some examples of some apps that are out there which do that. You put in where you want to start and where you want to end, and they will take care of where it is, how you're going to get there, the different modes of transport that you could use, how much it's going to cost, and you can pay online. I think that technology is pretty close, actually. If not in South Australia, then it is in other places, and it's certainly been talked about here.
We already do similar things. We have API integrations with a number of third-party apps in which you can book an Uber. There are also integrations with public transport apps, so you can book the full range of services you need from end to end, including Uber and public transport at the same time. On your initial comment about logistics in the morning, I think if you inspect the fundamental economics of car ownership, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. you use a car 4% of the time, but you pay 100% of the cost. In fact, you pay much more than 100% of the cost because most people finance vehicles and they pay interest on them, but they only use them 4% of the time. That there's a fundamentally broken kind of economic equation there. So the reason for that is that the alternative at the moment is paying someone else to drive you around, which is even more expensive. So that's when we get into Rita's world and things get very exciting. But I'm not sure I'd be looking to government to present solutions to people. I think there's probably enough incentive in the market for companies to be working cooperatively with each other, and to be frank, probably more efficiency and smarts in that area for them to be working to each other than looking for one central solution. I think you probably introduce a high degree of risk and probably a low degree of innovation if that's where you're looking for a solution.
Can I just quickly add to
Last
that?
comment.
Actually, if you look at the latest figures that have come out about how much it costs a year to run a car, and for South Australia, or for Adelaide, it's about $17,000. If you lived within a 10 or so kilometres outside of Adelaide and you took taxis, you probably find it wouldn't be much, if any, more expensive. So in fact, today it's more we are so wedded to our cars that we're so emotionally attached to them, and we see them as so convenient that we're willing to pay the price because it satisfies something else in us. And it's that the changes and the opportunities and the choices that are coming along, which is going to make people have other...
And the technology is now shaking that model to an extent where the economics are actually causing people to reconsider those choices. So, taxis at a particular price, UberX is 30 to 40% cheaper than that, Uber Pool is 40% cheaper than that. And so then it becomes so cheap that people start to reconsider their, the wedded nature of their relationship with vehicles.
I think the Lord Mayor wants the last word.
Chris, I think the answer to your prayers is in one word: automation. If we look at driverless vehicles, which I think is going to come upon us so much faster than what we're all thinking, is that it's more time efficient. We know that. I'd rather be doing something in that vehicle, talking to someone, making phone calls, working on my laptop, whatever I'm doing, other than holding the steering wheel. So time efficiency and productivity, tick. Carbon reduction, tick. These vehicles are mostly, of course, going to be electrically powered. Safety, tick. So you start looking at those three things, and they're very, very compelling. And you look at the productivity loss of people sitting in traffic for 10 hours a week. It's extraordinary. Why wouldn't you do it? And why wouldn't you just do it fast and get on with it? So I think this is something that South Australia can, again, lead nationally, is that the downside arguments of automated vehicles pale in comparison to the upside arguments of automated vehicles. It will change everything for all the right reasons.
And I think that's exactly right. I think this conversation is about efficiency ultimately and using what we have better. I think the last century was more about producing as much as we could, as fast as we could, as cheap as we could. And I think fundamentally that's going to shift, and is shifting very quickly into that kind of model. You talked about the minutes, adding the idea of productivity. I think maybe driverless cars, maybe we call them activity-based something, or change that perception a little bit. But I just recently, gladly, moved back into the city of Adelaide. I'm now living on Gilly Street, which is great. And I add up all those minutes that it saved me from driving to North Brighton, and it makes me far more efficient. And if you take a whole city or a whole state and add up all those minutes, what do we do with that extra time? It becomes a very, very powerful thing. So I think that's a very important thing for us to be considering. That's my last rant. Please join me in thanking our panel.